Hello. Check.
A very good afternoon to you all. It's a good custom during our international conventions that an introducer introduces a speaker. Not that long ago, our international secretary, Maria Artman, requested me to say a few words introducing the international president of the Theosophical Society, Mr. Tim Boyd. Obviously, it's a great honor and a pleasure to introduce him. But do I really need to introduce him? Don't you know him by now? Yes, I could talk about his extensive biography. I could mention that he was the national president of the Theosophical Society in America, that he headed the Theosophical Order of Service in the USA, and during those years, he proved to be more than a remarkable servant of social and spiritual causes, primarily building bridges, solely acting for the good of the people. But with your kind permission, rather than talking about Tim's past, I would like to focus on the present and the future. Tim Boyd, acting as international president, has been in this function for more than 5 years, and he has increasingly revealed himself as a person with a broad vision, performing practical action, and showing a deep sense of spirituality. His lectures and writings have inspired people all over the world. His manner of practical managing is currently accomplishing important achievements, such as the restoration of secular and invaluable historical buildings at the international headquarters at Adyar. To be straight to the point, Tim Boyd has very much succeeded in harmonizing and working with theosophical workers from various parts of the world in a unique and cooperative way. Tim has visited all four corners of the globe. He inspires the International Council as well sections worldwide, always working towards harmonizing our members. This is something very particular of him, this capacity to aggregate people and harmonize people. Well, friends, should I say more? Tim Boyd will address us on the very significant topic of the relevance of our work. Dear Tim, the floor is yours.
First, obviously, I would like to thank Marcos for his introduction. He's always very insightful and makes me try to think and look into what are the things that he said and whether they're true or not. I think to some extent, probably the most I can say is that along the way as a general counsel and as in the position of international president, we have tried. What I'd like to talk with you about this evening, as you are all aware, our topic, our theme for our time together during this convention has been nurturing the divine seed. So we've had an opportunity to hear a lot of different ideas and a lot of discussion about that. As an analogy, obviously, a seed. And although I won't belabor the analogy too much this evening, I think perhaps it would be appropriate for me to give my little spin on it while we have time together. Obviously, when we talk about a seed is a very, very specific thing. It is an embryonic life, often an embryonic plant life, but it's an embryonic life with a protective shell that surrounds it. We'll talk a little bit about that. Krishnamurti, as the young Krishnamurti in his very first book, number of profound things he said, but he made one very sweeping statement in that little book, At the Feet of the Master, that in all the world there are two kinds of people. Just somebody saying that should make us sit up and think. It's very broad. So in all the world there are only two kinds of people. And then he specifies, there are those who know and those who don't. And this knowledge makes all the difference. So in thinking about our subject of nurturing the seed, always my mind would necessarily turn toward the process and the person of the gardener. We are those gardeners to nurture this divine seed. But in terms of those who know and those who do not know, what is the specific knowledge of the gardener, of the one who has the capacity to assist in bringing something into bloom? Obviously, it is a person who through study, through observation, and through practice has come to have a very specific knowledge about the needs of this seed. Whether it's about the moisture content, the nature of the soil, the times that it needs shade, the times that it needs sun, the cycles of the moon and the natural cycles, seasonal cycles, are the sorts of knowledge that are necessary to a good gardener, to a gardener who knows. To a really good gardener, there's even a deeper awareness that not only the elements of nature, not only an awareness of the interdependence of all of these things, but an awareness that the human consciousness also interacts with the seed. I can remember when my daughter was in early school. My daughter's here, by the way. She was ill for a little while. I should say, too, when she was very young, she used to come to hear me talk. And when I would talk, somehow or another, I would find some way to mention her. She never failed to tell me afterwards how much she hated it. One time she was so vehement, "Dad, don't do that again." Next time I talked and she attended, I did not do it. After the talk, she said, "You know, Dad, you didn't say anything about me." So this time, it's actually relevant. Did an experiment, one of those science fair experiments. And in that experiment, there is the idea that a seed that is given human attention will grow faster and taller than one that is given negative attention. So we tried the experiment. And of course, it was one of those things that actually did work out to be true. There's a gentleman who wrote a wonderful book, a fellow by the name of Masaru Emoto from Japan. He wrote a book about the messages in water. And his premise was that the consciousness of the human being affects something as basic as water. So that a body of water or some water that is focused on with loving attention forms very different types of crystals than one that is given negative attention. He did an experiment with rice, where if you take the rice and even put the word beautiful on one jar of rice and the word ugly on the other, leave them alone for a couple of weeks, the one will be rotted and dark, the other one will be preserved and white. I tried that experiment too. I forgot I had done it. I put the containers of rice up on top of a shelf, forgot about it. When I was moving out of the house about a year later, I found them. And sure enough, the one that said ugly was dark and black. The one that had beautiful was still white in color. So these are ideas that a good gardener is aware of. To the scientific mind, that falls into the field of what they would call pseudoscience. The idea that these are untested premises because consciousness cannot be measured as yet. And so ideas that consciousness affects things like this are not quite accepted. But the premise is this, that for the gardener who is aware, who is in tune, we are aware that such things as love, compassion, kindness have an effect. And it's something that is testable. So from this sort of knowledge, what does the gardener know? From this lesser knowledge comes the greater life that springs forth from this seed. And this is what we want to talk about a little bit today. So, the seed, if we were to say what it is, obviously the seed is the soul. And there are certain impediments to the soul making its impression felt in this world and within our lives. Obviously, its impression, its influence tends to lie hidden within us. And the work for us in terms of nurturing is one that we have to discover. So, there is this expression that speaks about the nature of the work that we need to do. Obviously, when we know that there is this seed that needs to grow within us, we also know that there is in fact a method, a mechanism that is in place to deal with it. Very often I find myself coming back again to certain ideas. There is this expression that speaks about what it is that a human being actually is from the theosophical perspective. The question has been asked, what is a human being? And a human being has been said to be a combination of three things: highest matter, highest spirit, lowest matter, linked by mind. The highest spiritual realms and the lowest realms of matter linked by mind. Just as is the case with a good gardener, a gardener has a certain knowledge, but then there are things that the gardener does not know. The gardener may know how to bring a seed to life, but the gardener knows nothing about what that life is. What is it that is active within this seed that comes into expression? That the gardener cannot say. He can show you how it can come to be alive, but what it is, he doesn't know. And I think similarly for us, when we think in terms of this linking agency within us, which is the mind, it links the highest spirit with lowest matter. So it is the bridge between two conditions of mind. And so when we say the mind is focused on the lower, then that's something that it has this capacity to also focus on the higher. We don't know what spirit is. Basically, when we speak in terms of that which is spiritual, very often what we're talking about is what the way in which spirit impresses itself upon the mind. Similarly with matter, we talk about matter, and in fact matter is probably the most studied aspect of our awareness. The science of contemporary time has for the last 400 years been intensely involved in the study of one thing and one thing only, which is to say the material world. Everything related to the world of matter that we have been able to focus upon has been studied, from the electromagnetic spectrum to the biological world. All of these things have come under the scrutiny of scientists and the science of today. But if I were to say that really still we know nothing about it, it might seem like a very bold and broad statement, but it's the statement that is made by sciences of today. The contemporary wisdom, the contemporary knowledge in the field of science would tell you that in the big thinking about the way the universe is functioning, that there is this idea that the universe is expanding. And this expansion is dependent upon the qualities of matter that allow it to expand at a certain rate. And the computations of the moment would say that it cannot behave the way it does with the amount of known matter that there is in the universe. All that we can see, all that we can measure, does not account for the rate of the universe's expansion. And the numbers now would say that in order for this process to be behaving as it is, 95% more matter and more energy must be there than we have as yet discovered. And so it should be a humbling sort of thought. If I were a scientist, I think I would feel rather humbled by the idea that I'm studying and aware of 5% of what I have become convinced is the totality of the real world. But the terminology that has been given to this is now called dark matter. Dark matter basically meaning that matter which we don't know anything about. We can't see, we can't find, we can't test. So we know little about matter. But what we do know is that the mind has the capacity to bring into fruition something very deep from within. And so we have to learn actually how to utilize, learn what is this mind? What are the ways that it can be employed? And obviously, I think during the time that we've been together during this convention, we've had a chance to hear a number of things. One of the things that we have heard has been that the mind, its greatest function for us is to learn how to observe and to question, to observe. And so we begin with this process of observation. It has been said that the purpose of a conscious life is to know thyself. Over the oracle of Delphi, it was said, know thyself. And so this has become a direction that we are encouraged to adopt. The Buddha in his teaching talked about do no harm, do good, purify your minds. Another way it has been expressed. Great poet, I think, put it very, very well about the nature of the work that is for us to do. William Blake, in a letter, wrote that if the doors of perception were cleansed, then we would see everything as it is, infinite. If the doors of perception were cleansed. So the question becomes, how do we cleanse those doors of perception? What is it that in fact is obstructing our vision of reality, of the infinite? And that becomes the place where our work and the relevance of our work is established. So we begin by observing. And obviously our capacity to observe, each one of us, is perhaps a little bit different in that respect. So we observe the body and its functions. Very often, unaware, we find ourselves dissipating a great deal of energy just in useless motion, things that we're not aware of, where our feet are always tapping or our legs are always crossing. But when we observe, we have the capacity to alter that behavior. We observe our emotions. Probably in the world today, as we experience it, one of the most unfortunately prevalent emotions is anger. Very often, just traveling in the streets, we find episodes where anger erupts. And it's something that erupts very much unconsciously because it is unobserved. So we observe within ourselves the arising of the emotion, the expression of the emotion. Very often, I think it's unfortunate that specifically with anger, we become aware of it after the fact. There's an expression that if you speak when you're angry, you will make the most powerful speech that you will ever regret. If you speak from an angry mind, unaware, we make the most potent speech. We wound the most effectively with our words. Best speech we'll ever regret. When we are unaware of the activity of the emotions because we are unobservant. Same thing is true with our thoughts. The thoughts arise like clouds in the sky. They have their movement and then they dissipate. We get fixated on them to the point that we tend to think of ourselves as our thoughts. In the Mahatma letters, there's a very potent thing that is said about thought. It says that every thought, having been evolved, moves into the inner worlds as an active entity. Every time we think, we create forms even that take on a life of their own and that affect the environment within which we find ourselves. I do hope that during the time you have been here, you've had an opportunity to visit the Thought Forms paintings. These are the paintings that were done when Leadbitter and Annie Besant, through clairvoyant observation, described to an artist what it was that was being seen, what it was that the different thoughts were producing in terms of the forms that could be seen. Because it's very descriptive. For each one of us, we're continually involved in this process, so much so that the Mahatma in that same letter said that we are involved in a process of constantly evolving these entities that affect others, that are in effect peopling our current in space. So wherever we go, we bring our crowd with us, our crowd of thought forms, our crowd of creations that travel with us unaware. So the idea is to become increasingly aware. It begins with observation, but the point of observation is not just to note, but to become aware. The point of awareness is to eventually actually be able to see. And what we find is this, that when we speak about freedom, when we speak about liberation, all of the very high thoughts that we think about, we think of it in terms of a process. I do believe that very often it is our sense that it is possible to have an A, B, C approach to the spiritual life, such that as we complete this thing, we necessarily find ourselves springboarded to the next, and then from that to the next, and ultimately, of course, enlightenment, if we're good boys and girls and we do it in the prescribed manner. And while I do believe that there is some degree of correctness to that, I don't think that that's the entire story for us. So this observation is really part of the process side of awakening. And so in this process, as we observe, as we become aware, a certain possibility develops within us, and it is the possibility to see. When we think in terms of a seed is useless until the outer shell that surrounds it has been dissolved. As long as it's enclosed within that husk, the life may be there, but it cannot express. So what is the agency that causes the dissolution of this surrounding husk? In our case, another quote, there are in the theosophical teachings this thing called the three truths. You're familiar with it perhaps from the Idol of the White Lotus. And it speaks about what this seed is in fact. The soul of man, the soul is immortal. And its future is the future of a thing whose growth and splendor have no limit. The seed. The hidden life, the hidden light. The spirit which gives life is within us and without, cannot be seen, cannot be heard, cannot be smelled, but can be perceived by the one who desires perception. I mean, these are what are described as these three truths that it would be well for us to know. The third being that each person is their own absolute lawgiver, dispenser of glory or gloom to ourselves, the decreer of our life, our reward, our punishment. This describes the process. So as we engage in the process side, from the theosophical point of view, we tend to think in terms of study, meditation, service, as the process that leads us toward awakening, as the process that leads us to a deeper understanding of the actual work that we are here to do. That's good. But I think one of the things that we probably need to understand is that just as much as there is a process that allows for a possibility of unfoldment or enlightenment, illumination, self-transformation, there is also something we could describe as an actual event, a moment of insight, of transformation that occurs perhaps even independent of the process. So it's expressed in a lot of different ways. In the scriptures of the world, there are various ways that it's described. I particularly like in the Christian Bible, there is a psalm. It was really a song to the divine that was written by David of the Bible. And in this psalm, he says these words. He says, "He utters his voice," he being the divine, the higher self, the universal consciousness, utters his voice and the earth melts. It's beautiful words, but is a description of an experience that perhaps has occurred for many and perhaps has occurred for all of us. He utters his voice, and in the hearing of the voice, the earth melts. Another way it could be expressed is that the covering, the shell of the soul surrounding the soul is dissolved, and its radiance makes it so we can no longer see the world. The opening of the soul. So the way in which it occurs is one of those things that is not under our control. The process is. We can determine when we will meditate. We can determine how we will meditate. We can determine the subject matter of it. We can evolve thoughts of a helping nature. All of these things are part of the process. But the illumination is something that finds us, it has been said, it finds us like a thief in the night. I like the way that it's expressed. Like a thief in the night that comes into your house while you're asleep, that takes away from you the things that you feel are the most valuable and most important aspects of your life and your being, and you wake up in the morning with nothing. And in this case, you wake up with a sense that you have in fact become free. Because what are the things that are taken away? What is this shell that surrounds the soul? And I think for all of us, there is this problem that we deal with. When we think in terms of know thyself, any person who asks themselves, who am I? Very often it begins with a repetition of our positions that we occupy in the world. You know, I am a businessman. I am a theosophist. I'm a mother. I'm a homemaker. I'm an Indian. I'm an American. All of the things that we take as identities that are basically assigned to us, largely by birth. Any one of you who was born in India became immediately, without your knowledge, without your acceptance, without your choice, you were Indian by virtue of the fact that you were born in this place. If your family held a certain religion, by virtue of the fact that they had that religion, you were that religion. You were Hindu, Christian, Muslim. All of these things are things that we are assigned culturally and that we accept. After we have accepted it for a while, not only do we embrace it, but we try to expand upon it. We want to become good Indians, good Americans. And with that process, we become completely ensnared in this process of identity. The shell surrounding the soul becomes hardened, becomes multi-layered. It's covered with religion, it's covered with family, it's covered with nation, until the point that the soul has difficulty to even express itself. So the process is effective in eroding, in dissolving that shell. When we look, when we examine, when we ask the question, who am I, on this process of trying to know ourselves, clearly if we ask and if we really question, am I an Indian? And if you ask the question, really, you recognize very soon that the consciousness that is asking the question would be able to ask that same question no matter what body it inhabited. So no, it's not this. In Indian spirituality, there is this idea of neti-neti. Not this, not this. Who am I? Indian? No, not this. Male? Well, if I was female, I would still be able to ask the same questions, pursue the same truths. So it's not this. Layer after layer of these identities are the things that we dissolve in the process and that are completely removed with the event, the experience of self-transformation or illumination. So from this deeper level of actual experience, we start to become more deeply aware of our reason for being here. There is the seed, there is the work that we do in terms of nurturing the seed, then there is the experience of what it means for this light to become active within us. The Buddha has said, again, do no harm. As we become more deeply aware of this deepening sense of who I am, we start to also become aware of the fact that there is a deepening realization, a deepening understanding of the meaning of what it means to be in this body, in this world, in this moment. The mission statement for the Theosophical Society says many things about the work that we are here to do. We are here to serve humanity. We are here to cultivate a deepening understanding and a deepening realization. We are here to remove, basically, the sorts of bondages that we have placed upon this soul which is attempting to make itself known. This is the process. This is the event. There is a teaching that speaks about this moment, that we find ourselves with a precious human life. It says that a precious human life is something that requires a certain level of appreciation. Precious human life, it is said, gained but once. The idea that we find ourselves in a moment where we are exposed to a wisdom tradition, a wisdom teaching with the capacity for liberation, is a precious moment. And it's one that we find ourselves having to actually interact with in the proper manner. Many, many things. So, the relevance of our work. I think every one of us would be aware that in the world today, there are many conditions that are requiring attention. All of us recognize that. Also, we should recognize that we have been a part of the creation of that. We created the camera, part of the problem. But we've been involved in the creation of a number of things that are having far-reaching effects in the world today. And what is it that the Theosophical Society, what is it that is relevant to the things that are being faced in the world by us and by others? How is it that we can address this sort of issues that we all face? Human created, and probably the teachings relate to the wisdom teachings, the wisdom of the ages, is what the Theosophical Society's teachings speak of, theosophy. Knowledge is one thing, and knowledge is powerful. So for us to know is important, but the nature of that knowledge only goes so far. The wisdom that is the teaching of theosophy is the wisdom that we seek. So probably the work of the Theosophical Society and our work becomes relevant as we awaken. To the extent that we become aware, to the extent that we become enlivened, to the extent that we access what could be called the mystery of self-transformation, to that extent we become active in the world. There is the idea that iron, a bar of iron, may be cold. It has the potential for heat when laid next to some source of heat. We must become that kind of source of heat, source of light. So perhaps it would be well just to finish with the Buddha's teaching, do no harm. As we become much more aware, the harm that we cease to do, we find that we no longer are polluting agents in this world, not just at the level of the physical world, but we no longer are polluting agents in terms of the thoughts that we allow to be entertained in our minds, the emotions that we harbor, all of these things. We cease to do harm. The first law of being in a hole, it is said, if you find yourself in a hole, the first law is to just stop digging, stop deepening the problems at the minimum. Secondly, the Buddha said, do good. Do good is a relative thing. Very often, according to our lights, we say that one thing is good because it's the highest thing that we can understand at the moment. But we do good in the world, and we purify our thoughts. Those were the final teachings of the Buddha. Purify your thoughts. The way in which a stream which has become muddied, a pool which has become muddied, is purified is by running a stream of pure water through that muddy hole. So once we connect with a deeper source, a higher life, we find ourselves able to be a channel for that stream. There is an example in nature. It's something that I find myself attracted to. It's very simple. And I find myself speaking about this more and more often because it is in fact so simple. And it does in fact express to some degree the nature of this experience of awakening that leads us to a deepening state. The example that I find myself giving nowadays speaks about something that would probably be familiar to all of us. There is the example of a small puddle of water on the shoreline of the sea. and a puddle of water that is laying there, nothing particularly happening, but at a certain point, a wave washes across the puddle. In that moment, the wave comes through, and for a moment, from the point of view of the puddle, it sees itself from the point of view of the ocean. The experience of awakening is similar. As we become awakened in those momentary experiences, then we start to become able to see from the point of view of the universal consciousness. So probably at this point there's probably a whole lot more that could be said, but I think for today I've just about spent it. So I thank you for listening. I thank you for your kind attention. There is a great value to the work that we're doing. The relevance to the world in which we live now is something that we each have to discover for ourselves. But as we do, we will certainly find that its meaning becomes magnified to the extent that we are able to connect ourselves with others and connect ourselves with this deeper life within which we find ourselves embedded from moment to moment. So I thank you for your kindness.
Thank you, Tim, for your inspired words. I think you brought us direct to the point that is the aim of the theme of our convention. And I appreciate very much this analogy of the garden and the gardener and the work that is expected from us. Who is the gardener? What is the garden? The gardener is this mind that needs to be purified. Sometimes this mind links to the lower, sometimes it opens to the higher. We need to be watchful of it. And probably the garden is ourselves, our relationships, life as a whole. And the tools, the instrument of this gardener, observation, with exemption. Because when we observe judging, we are not observing. And then sometimes self-knowledge is really this work of the gardener, to see all parts of our being, sometimes not so beautiful, sometimes something that is not easy to deal. But with this instrument, exempt observation, we will do our work as gardeners, and the nature will do the flourish of the seed. It's not us that do this flourishment. Nature itself does. But self-knowledge is that perception of ourselves, perception of the others, perception of relationship. In this way, we can break the shell and permit nature to flourish within ourselves. Thank you very much for your inspired words, and this session is closed.